They won't let you take it. Okay, well, we'll see what happens. So please give me a call. Don't just let this thing drop. This is stupid. Oh, jeez, I put that on there. Tape. So we're talking about all the interesting, whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. We're talking about all the interesting things. Of course, we talked about this last time, that witches were getting sexually excited by riding on their broomsticks. That was the idea anyway. So if you had a broom made out of this stuff, they assumed you were a witch. All kinds of things. Of course, there's a lot of home remedies to things, and if you were one of those people that knew the home remedies, and you actually saved people's lives, they assumed you were a witch and then they killed you. The idea was that you had received your knowledge about all of these drugs from the devil, from Satan. So they assumed you were a witch and they stoned you, or they drowned you, or they burned you at the stake in order to kill you. But of course, there are a lot of plants that are medicinal. One of them is datura. It's also known as thornapple. This is all over the place. I mean, this is everywhere. You can find this any place where there are weeds. You can find a thornapple a plant. You can make it into a salve, and it's very soothing. It's absorbed through the skin. I use a salve on my arms because I have bad shoulders. I was planning on lifting today. It's Blue Emu. I'm sorry?
What's that?
I use Blue Emu. It works. It's a topical that takes the pain away, relieves the pain. Blue Emu.
Like Flexo?
I don't know Flexo.
454, Joe Namath did the commercial.
This stuff really works. Blue Emu really works, and they say it's just a topical, so it only works on the surface, but it goes into my joints. Yeah, it absorbs into the skin, and it relieves the pain in my shoulder so that I can lift. And then, of course, I'm really sore the next day. Henbane has been used as far back as ancient Egypt, 3,500 years ago. It was used as a painkiller and a poison. This isn't that common around here. I have seen it in the United States, but then again, I've been all over the place. In ceremonies, it was used to induce insanity, which in turn produced hallucinations that resulted in prophecies. Belladonna, which means beautiful woman, the amaryllis flower, is also known as witch's berry and devil's herb. This drug dilates the pupils, it inebriates the user, and can cause hallucinations and delirium. Of course, women would use it to dilate their pupils, and all the men thought that they were in love with them. Because if you're near somebody that you have that you're attracted to sexually or physically or emotionally or whatever, your eyes will dilate. It's just the way it works. So they were doing this, and most people don't even think about, well, let me look at the pupils of their eyes to see if they really like me, that kind of situation. But they pick up on it. I can remember I was working in the laboratory in Washington, D.C., in a children's clinic. And this little girl came in, and she had a problem with her eyes. So she opened her eyes really, really big all the time. And everybody thought she was in love with them. I mean, it was really kind of weird. She was a very popular child. She was 13 or 14 years old. I know she had a really serious problem because the boys wouldn't leave her alone. And the reason it wasn't because of her other physical attributes is because she had not only did she have big eyes, but she kept them open all the time. And people thought that she was attracted to them. It was a little unnerving the first time, this little girl comes in and she's got her eyes open wide like this. It was really kind of interesting. Anyway, that's what belladonna does. Keeps your eyes open and it dilates your pupils. Mandrake is also known as mandragora. It's the root of the plant. If you look at the root of the plant, it looks like a human. It's shaped like a human. In ancient Greece, they used it to make prophecies. It creates hallucinations and delirium. 15th century Italy was used as an aphrodisiac. We've been looking for an aphrodisiac forever. What makes people horny? can we find anything? Old men are going, geez, I need something. Yeah, I know.
I don't know.
Yeah, just keep shaking your head. When you get to be 150 years old, you're gonna be thinking, geez, I wish I could find an aphrodisiac so I could do it.
Besides, when you prepare to breathe on 150.
Of course, now we've got Viagra and Cialis and Levitra. I think that's it. Do we have any new ones? Okay.
No,
Just the old three?
just the three.
Kids are using this still. I know. Why? I know, it doesn't make any sense to me. I guess it's for prolonged erection, I'm guessing. I have no idea. These things don't make any sense to me. And I don't ask, I guess for prolonged erection. One of the strangest psychoactive drugs is ergot. It's a brownish purple fungus that causes cereal grain rust, especially on rye, but also on wheat, barley, and triticale. Triticale, you might know what triticale is. Triticale looks like wheat, but it's got a head like this. It's almost like a corn cob.
Oh, okay.
Has a real large seed. It has a nuttier flavor. Once upon a time in the United States, back in the 70s, they thought they tried to replace wheat with triticale because they got a larger yield. But they couldn't because they couldn't get people to eat it. It had a too nutty a flavor. It was too different than what they were used to. So it kind of fell off the fell off the table. We thought that maybe we could plant this in other places and we'd be okay, or we could help feed the world this way. But nobody likes it. I can remember. I was stationed in Lubbock, Texas at the time, and they were growing triticale up on the Llano Estacado. Anyway, they were making bread out of it, and I thought it was okay. I mean, I liked it, but nobody else bought it. You know, it was that kind of a situation. If you watch old episodes of Star Trek, at one point they're transporting triticale, and those fuzzy things got into it and ate it all. I don't know. It was a funny one where they couldn't. These things just kept reproducing. They almost took over the ship. I can't remember what they did. I think they opened an airlock and shot them all out into space. Triticale. Anyway, triticale is another grain. And like I said, has a much larger head. It tends to be less sensitive to weather than wheat, but nobody does it. Nobody uses it anymore. The active ingredient in ergot that causes the problem is lysergic acid diethylamide. This is what Hoffman found in Switzerland. He found the lysergic acid diethylamide. He was able to he was able to isolate it from the ergot. There have been outbreaks of ergot in Europe and in rye growing areas that caused widespread insanity and death. One outbreak in France in 944 AD is reputed to have killed 40,000 people. So LSD, especially if you ingest too much of it, I guess. Well, actually LSD, you can ingest too much of it. You get a reaction from it, and you can drink a whole bottle of it, and you're still going to have the same reaction. So you can't really overdose on LSD. It doesn't take very much to get into your system, but if you get too much into your system, it doesn't make any difference, because you only have your reaction is truncated. It's just where it is. It's just what it is. The first written use of caffeine came with the Olmecs in 3,500 years ago. They used coca, which is what we make chocolate out of, and they produced a stimulating drink. Chocolate has caffeine in it, and so if you eat, Hershey's candy bars, then you're getting a lot of caffeine. That's one of the things that people should be telling you, but you're also getting a lot of sugar. And the reason it's got a lot of sugar in it is because coca is really bitter, so you have to put a lot of sugar in it. So the Olmecs started drinking a hot chocolate or a chocolate drink, and they got stimulation from it. because of the caffeine. And then, of course, they passed it on to the Moche, and the Moche passed it on to the Inca. The Mayans drank the chocolate, and we've found chocolate going back, 3,500 years. So we have found it in the pottery. So we know that they were drinking it in one way or another. Of course, it was very bitter. But then again, coffee is bitter, isn't it? So you have to put sugar.
I don't notice it anymore.
You don't even notice it anymore. Tea was cultivated 1,700 years ago in China and has been used in Eastern Asia ever since. Coffee was first cultivated about 1,200 years ago in Arabia. That's Saudi Arabia, that big chunk of land over there between Africa and Asia, the Middle East. The invasion of the Americas by the Europeans opened up new markets for psychoactive substances. You gave us tobacco, we gave you alcohol. So there's a fair trade for you. Coffee, alcohol, and tea were brought to the Americas, and coca and tobacco was taken back to Europe. Chocolate was very, very, very popular in Europe, as was tobacco. They used it in a lot of different ways. They snorted it up their nostrils. They powdered it and snorted it up their nostrils. They chewed it. They smoked it. Any way that you can think of ingesting tobacco, they did. Coca was a little bit different. Snorting it doesn't really give you much of a high, but they put a lot of sugar with it, and now all of a sudden they had coca. Now, coca was considered an aphrodisiac. And it had so much caffeine in it that potentially it was an aphrodisiac to some extent. That's one of the reasons why on Valentine's Day, which is not that far away, is it? It's a month away. I gotta remember this because I have to get my wife something. One time she gave me an axe for Valentine's Day. An axe.
It's nice.
Isn't that sweet? How romantic. But I can't give her chocolate because she doesn't, she's always on a diet, so I can't give her chocolate. Anyway, the reason men gave women chocolate was to get lucky. That was the idea, because they thought it was an aphrodisiac, and the more chocolate they ate, the more likely that they would become sexually excited, and the more likely that they were gonna get lucky. Ritualized use of the stimulants become part of each culture, and of course that's what we've done with chocolate. It's something that you give somebody on their birthday. It's something that you give people at Christmas to make them happy. It's something that you give, it's romantic on Valentine's Day, so that romance will be a possibility. Opium came back to Europe in the form of the medication known as Theriac, which saw opium mixed with from 70 to 100 other medications. They put it with everything. They put it in salve, they put it in an elixir, they put it in things that you rubbed on your body. And they put it in alcohol. When they put it in alcohol, it's a tincture of opium. They made a tincture of opium, which is opium mixed in alcohol. They made laudanum. Laudanum is really kind of an interesting substance because it's alcohol mixed with opium. They used to use laudanum to treat all kinds of things. It was something that knocked you out. There's a shock for you. Take alcohol and opium, it's going to knock you out. It controlled pain, so if you had a toothache, you drank laudanum. And they used it to treat alcoholism. The idea was that you could drink laudanum and you'd stop drinking alcohol, which worked.
Is that like absinthe?
Absinthe?
I don't know.
Yeah, absinthe. Absinthe is wormwood. It's made out of wormwood. Wormwood is a poison. Yeah, I know.
I've only seen a real bottle of that once in Germany.
Well, it's against the law. It's even against the law in Europe. So if you saw one that was made before 1920, I think. They outlawed it all over the world.
It wasn't for sale, it was just a display.
Yeah. Yeah, that stuff's, it kills you. And that's what the problem was. I mean, alcoholism will kill you, but this is something, you start drinking and you're dead in a couple of years. You just poisoned yourself. It's like drinking arsenic. I think that's what's in wormwood, if I'm not mistaken, it's arsenic. So you're literally poisoning yourself. Okay, so when we talk about alcohol, we're talking about mead, we're talking about beer, we're talking about wine, we're talking about whiskeys, corn whiskey. Of course, the corn came from over here. But in the 1600s, they invented gin, as weird as that is. I don't know if you've ever tasted gin. I don't think it tastes very good. But it's got a flavor, and I guess if you drink, well, that's one of the reasons why they put cherry in vodka or peach in vodka. They need to give it a flavor because it doesn't really taste like anything. I mean, you can't, it burns your tongue, of course, but it doesn't taste like anything. But that's what they were doing with gin. They were putting flavors in gin. That's where sloe gin comes from. Sloe is a fruit with a really strange flavor. Because of the contamination of the water supply in Europe, they use their rivers for sewers. And they've been doing that for thousands of years. Because of that, you can't drink the water. We couldn't drink the water when we were over there. And we were in Germany 79 through 82. The only way that you can survive the only way you can get anything to drink is to drink something with alcohol in it. They would take water, they would mix alcohol with it. Usually it's pure alcohol so that they could decontaminate it. Alcohol does kill stuff, it kills off bacteria and whatnot. And so it worked. So practically everybody's drinking something with alcohol in it. Well, gin became a new drink and it became extremely popular. It was invented in Holland by the monks. And so they started making this stuff by the barrel load. It's relatively easy to make. It's relatively inexpensive to make. So they were making it by the barrel load and they were making just this huge, massive profit. It became very popular with the poor people in England because it was so cheap. And it got you drunk fast. It was a pretty good situation for them. Quickly, alcoholism rates and mortality due to drinking skyrocketed in the back alleys of London. Of course, if you were wealthy enough, you didn't drink gin, you drank wine, you drank sherry, you drank other liquors, you didn't drink gin. England's growing population stopped growing due to the deaths. There were so many people that died from this that their population growth stopped. Now at the same time, you have to remember there's no contraception over here. So these people, every time they have sex, potentially it ends up in pregnancy. It didn't really make any difference. There were so many people dying from alcoholism that their population growth rate went to 0 in England. One of the reasons why there are so many Englishmen all over the world, I mean, they inhabited Australia, they went to Canada, they came to the United States. Where did all these, it's not that big an island. Where the hell did all these people come from? Well, the answer is, in England, there's only one person that inherited from the father. So if you had 1,000 acres, then it went to the oldest son. The other sons, if you had other sons, they're SOL. They either had to wait for their brother to die, or they had to go someplace else. They didn't have any property. They didn't have a house to live in. It's known as primogeniture. The oldest son is the one that inherits.
Yeah, England really isn't that big.
It's not. It's not very large at all. So when the population kept exploding, they had to send these people someplace. So they migrated to the Americas. They migrated to Australia. They migrated all over the world. There were hundreds of thousands of Englishmen in India because it was a place to go. You would join the army or you join the clergy. It was usually the thing that you did. So I apologize for that. I have English ancestry, and probably we were like the second son or the third son or whatever, and that's why we're here, because we didn't have any place else to go. So that's one of the reasons why so many Englishmen came to the United States. Okay, so so England's population has stopped growing. Attempts to regulate gin production and distribution led to gin riots in London. Production rates tupled. They increased by a multiple of 7. That's how much gin was being poured into England. If you ordered a drink in England, it was a big glass of gin. We're not talking about wine, we're not talking about beer, which isn't gonna get you drunk that fast, but gin is relatively strong liquor. Finally, in 1751, new laws were passed and gin consumption returned to a less deadly level. They passed new laws that had to do with taxing the gin. And it reduced the number of people drinking gin. We do the same thing in the United States with tobacco. When I was in the military, we could buy a carton of cigarettes for $2. That's 10 packs of 20 cigarettes. That's 200 cigarettes. And we could buy it for $2. If you watch old movies, they used to use quarters to get a pack of cigarettes. They just drop a quarter in the machine and
When I was in Afghanistan, there was a PX, it was run by the Swedes.
okay.
Right? And you get a carton of like Newports, but it was English tobacco
Right,
for about $8.
$8. That's not too bad.
But
Now-
it was euros. So it's actually about, what, like $12.
Yeah, well, that's not too bad.
That's still not bad though.
Yeah, it's not bad at all. Of course, we realized that we were killing all the soldiers by giving them cheap liquor and cheap tobacco, so we stopped doing that kind of stuff.
To start putting in the MRE.
So then, well, yeah, stop.
Lucky Strike.
No. Old Gold, I think I've seen Old Gold and they don't even make it anymore. Still, control of psychoactive drug use was sporadic throughout the world. They had to decide if something was actually addictive or not. Nitrous oxide, laughing gas, inhaling parties were not uncommon in Victorian England, though the practice sometimes resulted in more fighting than laughing. It just makes you high, and of course, when people get high, they start walking around like they're King Kong, and then they run into another King Kong, and all of a sudden, we've got a fight going on. So despite the fact that they call it laughing gas, it does make you feel goofy. It resulted in a lot of fights. I've been stabbed by my wife, I've been shot by my neighbor, I was stabbed by my best friend in the stomach when he was drunk. I was trying to stop a fight, and he stabbed me in the stomach. I know. So it's people you know. The guy that ruptured my spleen was a good friend of mine.
Hey man, we just.
I don't have friends. I don't have any more friends. I hate everybody. Morphine was about 10 times as potent as opium. Morphine was used during the Crimean and Civil Wars to treat wounded casualties. Many men became addicted to the painkiller after these wars. It was called the soldier's disease, morphine addiction. So a lot of soldiers who were wounded during the Civil War, there were a lot of soldiers wounded during the Civil War, came back with a morphine addiction. Opium became dangerous to life and limb with the development of morphine, but it would get worse, of course, and it's getting worse and worse all the time. In 1855, the hypodermic needle was invented, making it possible to inject morphine, so during the Civil War, they could actually inject morphine and take away your pain. In 1874, morphine was synthesized into diacetyl morphine, which gained the name of heroin. And the reason they called it heroin was because it was heroic. That was the idea. So they gave it the name of heroin, so that people would use it. Heroin was 2 to sometimes 5 times stronger than morphine. So here now we have heroin, and we have morphine, and we have opium. Okay. But it gets worse. You know it gets worse. We've got fentanyl. Opium becomes involved in one of the oddest events in the history of psychoactive substances. The British were addicted to caffeine and tea, but the Chinese demanded silver bullion to buy the tea. That's where all the tea was grown in China. The Chinese wouldn't allow it out so that we could grow it anyplace else. It grows best in China anyway. But the Brits couldn't get a hold of it because the Chinese demanded silver for it. The British had no commodity that the Chinese wanted, that the Chinese would buy with silver, so they couldn't sell them they couldn't trade them anything in order to get their tea. The Chinese had eradicated opium smoking from their country in around 1000 AD. So there were very few addicts, but they still knew what opium was in China. But it was against the law. If somebody found you smoking opium, they beheaded you almost instantaneously. So that kind of kept people from smoking dope. In 1839, the British battled the Chinese to open their ports to the opium trade. This is like fighting a war for oil or fighting a war for one thing or the other. They were fighting a war to open up the Chinese ports to opium. Opium was against the law in China, but they fought a war so that they could trade opium to the Chinese. They lost the war. The Chinese lost the war in 1842. They had select treaty ports where the British could trade opium, and one of those treaty ports was Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is based, and it was in a swamp. They built Hong Kong in a swamp, so, on a series of islands. So Hong Kong was based on opium trade. A lot of millionaires, a lot of very wealthy Englishmen in this time period became wealthy because of the opium trade. Isn't that sweet? So most of your rich families in England have a history of opium trading. But they weren't done. There was the Second War. There weren't enough treaty ports. So they decided to fight another war with Chinese in order to open up more ports. The war lasted for 4 years. Millions of people were killed. Most of them were Chinese, of course. But it worked. They won the war again, and they opened up more treaty ports. Trade went from 15 tons in 1800 to 2.5 million tons. I know. By the turn of the 20th century. So where the hell were they growing their opium? They were growing their opium in Afghanistan and India, which is a great place to grow opium. And then they were trading it to the Chinese for tea.
Fields and fields of that crap.
Yeah, I know.
Still.
Yeah, my brother dealt with this when he was over in Afghanistan. The British had cheap tea, and the Chinese, of course, now had addiction. So if you understand the Chinese in the United States, wherever there were Chinese, there were opium dens. When I was in Montana, one of the towns in Montana, there had been a prairie fire, and it burned the whole town down to the basements. So people started living in the basements. So you can still go down there and look around. They have candy shops, they have ice cream parlor, they have brothels down there. They also have a Chinese opium den. Now, because they had Chinese railroad workers, and also they had a Chinese laundry in town. Now, the interesting thing is, if you killed somebody who was Chinese in Montana, it wasn't against the law. You could kill somebody who was Chinese. So they would play games where they would take an ice floe, and they would tie the Chinese man to the ice floe, and then they would take bets on how fast or how long it took him to drown. I know. That sounds like a fun game. I don't know. Well, we know how
a lot of money.
Yeah, we know how to have it. So Chinese had no status as humans. But there's an opium den, and today, if you go to Havre, Montana, there's no Chinese there. But we know there had been Chinese there earlier. What happened to them? Well, they were all killed off by people trying to have a good time. Cowboys trying to have a good time. There was an army post right outside of Havre, Montana. In 1859, cocaine was synthesized from the coca leaf. It quickly became a new medicine. It was used as a topical anesthetic and used for eye surgery, and it works. It was mixed with wine to make a new, stronger concoction. Wine plus cocaine. It was used by Freud to control asthma. It was used for gastric problems and as an aphrodisiac and to relieve depression. It didn't work very well with depression because you didn't know if it was going to work or not. It's kind of like psilocybin. They use it for depression now, but it doesn't work on everybody. Well, it was the same way with this stuff. Actually, Prozac doesn't work on everybody. Okay, so sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It all depends on you, it all depends on your mood, as weird as that is. Okay, but we're not done with cocaine. During the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, many patented medicines were manufactured with what would become illegal drugs, either opium or with cocaine. Coca-Cola, the coca portion of it, actually means cocaine. Coca-Cola was first manufactured with 5 milligrams of cocaine and continues to contain coca extract with the cocaine removed. Okay, this is really kind of fascinating. It's still in there, and it still gives it its distinctive flavor. Now, I've always known that Coke had something in it that Pepsi didn't, or RC Cola, or any of the other colas. It tasted different. There was a hint of something in there, and I always thought it was cloves, but it's not cloves, it's cocaine. Coca-Cola continues to be the largest purchaser of Trujillo coca leaf. So they use the extract to make the Coca-Cola, and that's what gives it its distinctive flavor. It's not addictive anymore. The substance in there to wake you up is caffeine, but it still has the flavor in it, as weird as that is. Okay, so let's talk about opium. So we've got morphine, which is 10 times stronger than opium. We've got heroin, which is up to 5 times stronger than morphine. And now, of course, we have fentanyl, which is 100 times stronger than morphine. Now, they used to just knock you out with morphine, but they don't do that anymore. Now they knock you out with fentanyl and morphine. But now we have a new drug. It's 1,000 times stronger than morphine. And my question is, who needs something that's 1,000 times? When they manufacture this stuff, you can die of an overdose just from breathing the dust in the air, from making the
They don't like cut it or anything, it's just straight.
it's 1,000 times stronger. It's a tiny little, I don't know, have you seen it?
Not yet.
Okay. It's called Dasuvia, D-S-U-V-I-A, Dasuvia. And it's 1,000 times stronger than fentanyl. No, morphine's 1,000 times stronger than
What would you
morphine.
use it on?
I don't know.
An elephant?
I haven't.
It just doesn't make any sense. Yeah, exactly. Do they use it on elephants? They can't breathe the dust. So why in the world would they even manufacture this stuff? Most of our fentanyl comes out of China. And a lot of it's smuggled through Mexico. But, I don't know. That's the only way they can knock me out is with fentanyl. So, good, I'm glad they've got it, but I don't think I need Dasuvia.
I don't think anybody does.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Okay, so we've had a problem with inebriation over an extended period of time. The Brits, they almost killed off their whole population by drinking gin. And in the United States, it's worse. England has laws, and England tries to control things. But in the United States, everybody thought that they were free to do whatever the hell they wanted to do. And so one of the things they wanted to do was get drunk every night, or drink a lot of alcoholic beverages. And they did. We drink a lot more alcohol than the Brits. Well, we don't actually. Well, that's the upper class. We drink a lot of alcohol in the United States. The Canadians drink a lot of alcohol. The Australians drink a lot of alcohol. The Irish, of course,
They have a pub on every corner.
Irish coffee, which is
Yeah.
a really potent drink. So we've always had this really serious problem with alcohol. Drunken high men made very poor workers, and they made worse husbands. You certainly don't want your workers to get drunk at lunchtime. When I was in Germany, they would drink 2 pints of, that's all right, 2 liters of beer at lunch. And you were allowed to do that. Then they'd go back to work. Well, they weren't very functional after lunch, but they'd have these
Beer is pretty strong too.
2 liters. Yeah, their beer's a lot stronger than our beer. But they made really bad husbands too. Alcoholics are not real fun. Well, maybe they are. but they don't make very good husbands. They just don't.
Or wives,
I'm sorry?
or wives.
Or wives, that's true. Inebriation impeded responsibility and abuse among drinkers was common. So the women were not only, were they abused at home, they were being physically abused. They were being beaten when the husbands came home. So women banded together and they created the temperance organizations. The first temperance organization in the United States started in 1826. The whole feminist movement is based on this temperance movement. And it started in 1826. The idea was that, of course, the Bible says that men are in control, and women said, you know, that's okay unless you're a drunk, okay? And that's not okay. So they started these temperance movements, and it started in 1826. To understand why temperance was so widely accepted in the United States, we have to understand the women's lot in the early 19th century. Not only did the Bible tell you that men were in charge and they had to do what the man said, women couldn't inherit property, women couldn't inherit anything. They had no rights whatsoever. They couldn't sign a lease. They couldn't sign anything. They had to have a man sign for them. So if a man had owned all daughters and he died, his property went to the oldest male heir. It didn't go to any of the females. It couldn't, because women couldn't own property. Damn it, they couldn't own property. Contraception was illegal in the United States. No condoms, no pills that you could take, it was illegal. And if they found you, if they found you not conceiving children, then you could get arrested and thrown in jail, as weird as that is. You like that? So women were having a dozen kids, 18 kids, 21 kids. They were just popping out babies every 9 months or so. Women were pregnant almost constantly, and a lot of them died in childbirth, sadly enough, because not all women are able to have babies. Of course, that doesn't happen anymore because we have cesarean sections. A lot of women in the United States choose to have cesarean sections rather than a natural birth, just because, I don't know, just because they don't want to go through the trauma of a real birth. The drinking pattern in the United States followed the path of cheapest booze. Corn liquor was least expensive, so men tended to drink voluminous amounts of whiskey. So men are drinking just buckets and literally gallons and gallons of alcohol a year. Women saddled with a sporting husband were likely to raise their children in poverty and have to accept his drunken abuse because he was in charge. And if she called the cops, if she wasn't dead, then they didn't do anything about it because they had no legal right to arrest somebody who was beating on their wife or their kids. They could beat their kids to death and nothing would happen. They could beat their wives and nothing would happen unless they killed them. So they could whale the tar out of her, knock all of her teeth out, and he would not be arrested. Isn't that great? The U.S. consumption of alcohol in 1830 was 7.1 gallons of pure ethanol. We're not just talking about whiskey. Whiskey is about 50-50. So that would be like 14 gallons of whiskey a year per person. That's every man, woman, and child in the United States. So if the kids weren't drinking any booze and the women weren't drinking that much, that means that the men were consuming gallons and gallons and gallons of whiskey. And this is hard liquor that we're talking about. We're not talking about Coors Light. It's not what they were consuming. They didn't really drink that much beer or wine. They were drinking hard liquor. Every time they drank hard liquor. And this was relatively common in the United States. So if you watch an old movie that was made in the 1920s or 1930s, when they poured a drink, it was a glass. It was a 12-ounce tumbler full of liquor. Not beer, not wine, but liquor. That's a lot. Today, we average 1.8 gallons. per person.
Dang. Big difference.
So each of you, I hope you consumed your alcohol for the year. Oh, wait a minute, it's January, isn't it? I hope you were good and drank your 1.8 gallons of alcohol last year. I don't drink at all, so you can have mine. Wait a minute. You don't drink at all, so they,
No, I stopped.
yeah, you stop. That's that's another 1.8. I'm just trying to help you guys out in case you're looking for your 1.8.
That's 5.4.
That's a lot of food.
That's a lot of alcohol.
Drink, man.
But can you imagine 7.1 gallons per person? This is pure alcohol, 200 proof. You can't even make alcohol that's
Oh, that freaking-
less than 180.
It's like moonshine.
Well, Everclear is 1.8.
Everclear, yeah.
This is stuff in Georgia. It's in like a 1970s label where it's orange and like puke green. It just says golden green.
How much, what's the proof on it?
A lot.
A lot, yeah.
I took 3 shots. I was going to drill sergeant school there, and you know, weekends.
Sure,
Yeah.
of course.
3
Military.
shots. I was
Gone.
done.
Where do you get that?
Yeah, it's actually made in I don't know what city, but it's made in Fulton County.
Oh, okay.
So it's by Atlanta.
That's Atlanta, yeah, it's right there. Wow.
That's strong.
Okay, so we got a really serious problem. 7.1 gallons of alcohol per year is a lot of alcohol, just lots. And this is pure alcohol we're talking about. So that everybody, they had a really serious problem. They needed to do something about it. And they did. The temperance movement started in 1826, and it slowly took hold. By 1851, they had their first state that prohibited alcohol, 1851. And that state was Maine, with a lot of seafaring men and whatnot. By 1855, 1/3 of the states in the United States had laws controlling the sale and the use of alcohol, 1/3 of all the states in the United States. In order to ratify an amendment to the Constitution, you need 2/3. And by 1855, they had 1/3 of the states that already had prohibited alcohol. In 1920, enough states, 33 out of 48, limited the use of alcohol to lead the passage of the Volstead Act, prohibiting the manufacture or sale of alcohol in the United States. The reality was that most of the states in the United States had already prohibited alcohol by the time Prohibition hit. Now, when we hear stories of Prohibition and we look at what was going on at the time, most of those states didn't have any problem with Prohibition. They had already had Prohibition for an extended length of time. But there were states that did have a problem, and those states were the ones that people focus on. Illinois. Indiana had had Prohibition since the 1890s. They didn't have a problem with it, but Chicago did.
That's where Capone came in.
That's where Al Capone came from. Downstate Illinois didn't have a problem with it because they were different. The reason that Chicago had so much trouble with it was because they had so many immigrants. Italian,
What
Polish.
California?
California, I'm not really sure what was going
Well,
on in
maybe because of
California.
Hollywood.
You guys were so far away from everything else that nobody cared what was going on out there.
Damn.
But we did care about New York, we did care about Chicago, and we did care about Cleveland, because they were the industrial centers of the United States. In the 1920s, California was just part of the West. It wasn't really.
Really?
Yeah,
I
it's
thought Hollywood played a big part.
not, well, Hollywood didn't become really important until right around the World War I.
Yeah, like, was it the late 20s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when like Charlie Chaplin started coming out, Buster Keaton.
Most of the early movies were made in New York.
Yeah.
As weird as that sounds. Anyway, so we do have a problem in select places, but we don't have a problem in other places. The Canadians, of course, never had Prohibition, and the Canadians drink a lot more alcohol than we do today. As interesting, and they drink harder liquor. I can remember playing in softball tournaments in Montana, and Canadian teams would come down, and while the people from the United States would be drinking beer, they would be drinking whiskey. Canadian Club was their favorite drink. We played this one Canadian team.
I've had
and
Canadian mist before. A Canadian.
it's
color.
pretty strong stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Every time they got a hit, somebody would run out and give them like a whiskey, give them a shot of whiskey. Or if they give them a pull on the bottle, as weird as that is. You know, and they were better than we were, and they were kicking our butts until about the sixth inning. By the sixth inning, they were so inebriated, they couldn't even find the ball, you know? So everything was a base hit. You know, you dribble one in front of the plate and the catch would run out and fall down. It was almost like Keystone Cops. We beat them. Don't worry, we beat them. We knocked them out of the tournament too. And they were supposed to win, but because they were supposed to win, they didn't, you know, they thought that they could do anything. And the answer was no, you can't. Alcohol wasn't the first psychoactive substance that they regulated. Of course, this was in 1919 when the Volstead Act was passed. Volstead Act was in place for 13 years, until 1932. By 1909, the Opium Exclusion Act was passed, banning the importation of opium into the United States for use other than medicine. Okay, so why in the world why did they care about opium? Why? Who were they trying to control? A lot of this has to do with money, and a lot of this has to do with racism. So what race were they trying to control when they outlawed opium? The Chinese. It was illegal for Chinese to immigrate to the United States. We had passed that law in 1889. That the Chinese, nobody from Asia could immigrate to the United States. So it was illegal for them to come here, but they were here already. Now the problem for the Chinese was that when they immigrated, when they came to the United States, only the men came over, not the women. There were very few women that came over. So their population grew really slow because there were 6 men for every woman. And the Chinese don't find us very attractive, or non-Chinese attractive. So it's not like they were intermarrying with non-Chinese people. So they had to, if somebody had daughters, he was rich because he could sell his daughters to somebody so that they could reproduce, as weird as that is. And of course, all the men were after all the women, because there weren't that many women, there were an awful lot of men. But they were still having problems with opium dens in the United States. Any Chinatown had opium dens. 1914, the Harrison Narcotic Act was passed, labeling opium as a narcotic. And of course, at that point, it was controlled by the federal government. While the Volstead Act was repealed in 1933, it was intact for 14 years. Other psychoactive substances have been added to the list of controlled substances in the United States. 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, banning the cultivation of cannabis. We weren't making, we didn't need ropes at this time, so we weren't growing hemp. But we did have cannabis in the United States. Now, who were they trying to control in 1937? Remember, a lot of these laws have to do with racism. And this one is very definite. We can go back and look at the newspapers in California, and we can see that Hearst was trying to block somebody in the United States. So where did cannabis come from? And who did he dislike that he was trying to control?
Hearst, like Hearst Castle?
Yeah.
The magazine guy?
Yeah. The newspaper magnate. Who is he trying to control? The Mexicans. Marijuana came from Mexico. Originally it came from China, of course, but he was trying to control the Mexicans. He didn't want them, he was against them just coming across the border. At that time, the Mexican-US border was fluid. Like, all you had to do was tell them that you're coming in or going one way or the other, and they didn't care. Nobody cared.
It was like that up until about 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, and then somebody decided there's too many people too many immigrants in the United States. 1965 drug abuse control amendments regulated the manufacturers of stimulants and depressants. In 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act consolidated all the drug legislation so that they would be controlled out of the same office. In 1984, the legal drinking age was raised to 21. I can remember when that happened. Most states already had 21. There were only a handful of states that, where it was legal to drink at 18. One of them was Ohio, and of course I'm from Indiana, and people would go from Indiana when they were 18 years old. They could drink in Ohio, but of course the drinking age in Indiana was 21. I lived in a county that was dry. Well, it was a Methodist county, and Methodists are theoretically don't drink. They do, but not that much. The county right next to us was Randolph County. Randolph County had Quakers in it, and Quakers don't drink either. So they were a dry county, and they were right next to Ohio. As strange as that is. Okay, so they passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention Control Act in 1970. So why in 1970? What the hell was going on in 1970 that they wanted to control? The federal government cracked down on drugs in 1970. So it's not like these drugs weren't there in 1969. Who were they trying to control and what was going on? Civil rights, anti-war movement. They had all these college kids that were wandering around and they were rioting in the streets. Nixon wanted to control those kids. This is during my war, okay? The war in Vietnam started in 1963. It kicked up in 1965 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. By 1970, there was rioting in the streets in Washington. And he had no, and of course it's legal to have a gathering. You can do that in the United States, that's legal, but he needed to arrest these kids and get them off the street. So what he did, he started cracking down on the drug laws. Part of the civil rights movement was the use of drugs. I mean, it wasn't a big part of the civil rights movement, but this was an excuse for putting people in jail. So Nixon was trying to control the rioters or the kids. I call them rioters, but in reality they were just protesting the war. They were just protesters. So he was trying to control the whole movement. He didn't like it at all. And if you listen to the Nixon tapes, you can hear him saying really nasty things about the kids. And this is when I got into trouble. Of course, I didn't use drugs. That wasn't the problem. The problem was I became a student leader, and because I was a student leader, they assumed I was anti-war. I was anti-war to some extent. I joined the military later on, but this is when I was put on a list. Nixon's blacklist. He had like 10,000 students in the United States on this list, and I was one of them. It was fairly inaccurate. He had taken my picture a couple times. One time I wasn't even in the protest. I was just walking past, and he got a picture of me. So a friend of mine who was in the State Department from my college said, "Hey, you're on Nixon's list." This is in 1970, 71, 72. I was already in the military. He said, "You're on Nixon's list. So be careful, because strange things were happening to these kids. They're being followed by the FBI. Well, they didn't have to worry about me because I was in the military, so I was being controlled by the military. Anyway, so I have an FBI file.
That's cool.
Well, yes and no. I mean, but then I was in the military for 12 years, and then I was with my wife until she was in the military, so it was not like they couldn't keep an eye on who I was and what I did. Some really strange things happened in Germany to me, but we won't go into that. They kept calling me into the OSI and questioning me about different things. Why? When Reagan came to Ramstein, I was stationed at Ramstein. When Reagan came to Ramstein, they sent me home. They wouldn't let me be on the base when.
Well, they thought you were a radical.
They assumed, like I'm going to assassinate Reagan with a needle. I mean, I didn't have a gun. I didn't have a weapon. All I had was a needle to draw blood with. I don't think I could have killed him with that. Anyway, they sent me okay, so the question is, did prohibition work? This is a huge argument because right now, people who are in favor of legalizing marijuana, they're using this as an argument as to why we should legalize marijuana.
It was two totally different things.
They are different things, but this is still an argument that they use. They say, look at prohibition, look at all the crime that was committed during prohibition. So let's look at it. Let's take a look at it and see what actually happened. If you are somebody who looks at criminal justice, then that's one way to look at it. But we can look at it medically as well. Was it good for the United States or was it bad for the United States? And it really depends on your perspective. Good things that transpired from prohibition: cirrhosis of the liver and other alcohol-related diseases declined dramatically because you had to buy your alcohol illegally. Now, when we talk about speakeasies, you're really talking about New York, Chicago. You're talking about municipalities. You're talking about urban areas. The rural areas, when they outlawed alcohol, they had no way of getting it. There weren't speakeasies in Daleville, Indiana. It's too small, and everybody knows what's going on. Everybody knows who's sleeping with everybody else, so why wouldn't they know where the speakeasy was? Domestic violence fell precipitously. So before, the guy was coming home, he was drunk, he didn't know what he was doing, he wailed away on his wife and kids. Now all of a sudden, he's not drunk anymore because it's too hard for him to get alcohol. So the domestic violence went way, way down. Violent crime actually fell by 2/3 in the United States. Fell by 2/3. Public drunkenness, of course, disappeared. If you were drunk and they found you, then they arrested you. And before, they just let you go the next day. But now, of course, you were charged with possession of an illegal substance. So now you could go to jail. Now you could go to prison for an extended length of time. So public drunkenness went away completely. So socially, it looked pretty damn good. Medically, it looked pretty damn good. Women weren't being beaten. The kids didn't have to worry about dad turning on them. The diseases in the United States were reduced. It looked pretty good. What negative things transpired that were directly related to the Volstead Act? There was an increase of organized crime, especially in the urban areas, especially in Chicago and New York. So where did they get their money? Where did people get their money? A lot of people were bootleggers, and that's how the Kennedy family made all their money, was by transporting alcohol across the Canadian border. They're up in Massachusetts. They had yachts. They had a lot of sailing craft, so they would just smuggle it into the United States, and that's how they made all their money, the Kennedy family. Joe. Corruption of politicians, of course, organized crime paid them off. Corruption of law enforcement personnel, organized crime paid them off. Drinking eventually returned to pre-prohibition levels, but it took 20 years for it to get back to where it was before. And since that, the population had markedly increased. The amount of alcohol consumed was actually lower per person than it was before. It was 7.1 gallons in 1830. It's 1.8 gallons per person today. So you can see it's been cut by a factor of 5. So did it work? Did it? We don't drink the same things that we drank before. Before we were drinking hard liquor. Now, most people, when they drink beer or wine. Did it work? Yeah, it reduced the consumption of alcohol in the United States markedly. If we go someplace where they didn't have prohibition, like right across the border up in Canada, the answer is, yeah, those guys drink a lot more than we do. And of course, you can look at the booziest places in the world. I can't project it up here, it doesn't work on this thing for some reason. So what's wrong with pot? We're talking about prohibition, and that's really the question as far as pot is concerned. Hemp was grown in the Americas with little problem until it first began to be smoked as a mild hallucinogen in Texas in 1910, from whence it spread to the rest of the West. So it wasn't in the East. The people east of the Mississippi River didn't smoke marijuana. There wasn't any marijuana to smoke. But in the West, of course, it became ditchweed. There was hemp being grown. Of course, the female plants had THC in them, male plants hardly any. So people were drinking the wacky weed in Texas, and then it kind of spread all throughout the West. So California, Colorado, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. That's the only places where they found marijuana. In the 1930s, the Hearst newspaper ran a propaganda campaign to label marijuana as a narcotic. Part of the complaint with the marijuana was that it was being brought into the United States by Mexicans. So it was a way to control the illegal entry of that population. So he's trying to control Mexican immigration into the United States. He didn't like Mexicans. At this time, there was an anti-immigrant movement taking place in the United States. The labor unions were against bringing in all of these people, because the more people that came into the United States, the less money that they were able to make, because they could just say, well, geez, you want a raise, just go home and I'll hire an immigrant. There's all these people coming into the United States looking for jobs. So there was an anti-immigrant movement going on in the United States. One group that was against immigration was the Ku Klux Klan. Another group was the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, why in the world would a group of women get together and brag about their Revolutionary War ancestry? Why would they do that? And the answer was, they did it because that meant that they had been here for 200 years. Because their ancestors had fought in the Revolution. That meant that they weren't the new immigrants. 60% of all the immigrants that came into the United States came into the United States between 1880 and 1920. 60% of all the immigrants. That meant almost everybody, that meant that a lot of people that you ran into were first, they had just come into the United States. First generation immigrants, okay. And they didn't like that because that lowered the wages. So there were a lot of people that were against this. And Hearst was one of them. He was trying to stop immigration, but he was trying to stop it from a different perspective. So he did it by doing a propaganda campaign against marijuana coming into the United States.
Have you ever been to his castle?
Where?
His castle.
Oh, Hearst? It's up near San Francisco, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, I've never been.
There's this, we used to have like a bunch of movie stars over there, Elvis, freaking Marilyn Monroe, like
Right.
James Dean, all of them, right?
Right.
Well, there's this one room where like his pool, there's no water in it now,
Right.
but the bottom of it is 14 karat gold.
Oh, gee.
Flakes. And he has this one room where it's like a full movie theater, but it's in his house.
He owned all the newspapers in California. So if you read a newspaper in San Francisco, it was a Hearst newspaper. If you read one in Los Angeles or San Diego, it was a Hearst newspaper.
Well, shoot, still not even magazines.
And he,
What's that woman's name? Cosmo.
Cosmopolitan?
Yeah, that's a Hearst magazine.
Yeah.
too.
Well, it's not anymore.
This guy was loaded, seriously, like, holy crap.
Yeah, he had.
And there's literally a castle, like the road goes like this,
Mhm.
and it's up there. It's crazy.
Where in San Francisco?
It's
outside of San Francisco.
it's in Monterey, I think.
Yeah.
It's in
Okay.
Monterey.
Yeah.
It's like north central California,
Yeah, in Monterey, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
like past Big Sur and everything. Yeah, that's nice.
I don't
If you
think.
like castles.
Well, I didn't go that far. I went to San Francisco in April, but yeah.
You missed the Hearst Castle.
Yeah.
Ah. You want to see castles, go to Germany. They got lots of castles.
Yeah.
By 1936, 38 states had branded marijuana as one of the most dangerous drugs, marijuana. 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, banning the growth of marijuana in the United States. Marijuana was used as a drug only in rural areas where it grew wild and in back rooms of cities where it was identified with jazz musicians and beat poets. And this is, of course, a picture of beat poets. This is from New York City. This is This is right outside the Stonewall Bar. That's Allen Ginsberg. That's Allen Ginsberg right there. Allen Ginsberg came to my college when I was there, and he gave a reading. Of course, nobody understood what he was saying, because if you've ever read his poetry, none of it makes any sense. But he was a force, and actually, I met him. I was working in the cafeteria. He came in the next morning after his reading, and he was eating his and he was fixing his breakfast. And he asked me what I was going to do, and I said I'd like to be a writer. And he said, well, you know, if you're going to be a writer, you got to be used to rejection, and nobody will start reading your shit until you're in your 30s, which is what happened to him, of course. Now he's a really famous poet.
Yeah.
But you can potentially you can identify the rest of those guys, but if you're an English major anyway. 1950s and 1960s, the influence of the beat poets support of using psychoactive substances, including marijuana, as an act of rebellion caught on with the youth of that era. So they were able to talk these people into smoking pot, to taking drugs, to shooting up with heroin. A lot of these individuals went from pot to heroin, and then they overdosed. Ginsberg was gay, and he died of AIDS about 15 years ago. This guy standing right beside him is his boyfriend. What was his name? Burroughs. His name is Burroughs. And he had to flee to Mexico in order to keep from being arrested. He was a drug addict, and of course he died of drug overdose eventually. A lot of dead bodies due to drugs. With the beginning of the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement became intermingled with the youthful rebellion, which by this time was connected to the marijuana usage. So we had a lot of things going on. The civil rights movement started in the 50s, and it got entangled with the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement, there was a lot of drugs involved with it. Civil rights movement, not so much, but the anti-war movement became entangled with all of this drug stuff. So if you were part of the subculture of that time, the anti-war movement, then you got entangled with all this stuff. You grew your hair long. You listened to psychedelic music. You protested against the war in Vietnam, and of course you got arrested for one thing or another. Usually you got arrested for protesting. Of course they couldn't hold you for very long. But then they would, if they found any drugs on you, then they threw you in jail for an extended length of time. It was really kind of a strange time. It was hard to identify yourself as to who you were, because if you weren't part of the anti-war movement, you didn't have any friends. It was kind of sad. If you had short hair, you didn't have any friends. So people grew their hair relatively long, just to fit in, as it were. We knew who the soldiers were because the hairstyles would identify you as either a member of the military or as a cool guy.
Fucking high and tights, man.
No, not that at that
Or
time.
flat tops, huh?
They wore flat tops before the war. During the war, it became a crew cut. No high and tights yet. Not even the Marines wore high and tights at this time.
Shit, no, all of them.
Oh, this is
So like old Jordays.
1965, 1960s. Watch the television in the 1960s. Look at their hairstyles. It's really kind of interesting. Women had straight hair, so they would, if they had curly hair, they would iron their hair to straighten it out. As weird as that is. My first wife wasn't that attractive. This is on tape. Wasn't that attractive, but she could grow hair. Oh, I can remember she cut her hair short 1967. And by 1969, her hair was down almost to the floor. And of course, guys were just crazy over that kind of stuff. They loved long, straight hair. Anyway, and that was her only attraction. The rest of her physical attributes didn't have any, she wasn't that attractive. But she had long hair, and so guys came out of the woodwork chasing her because of her hair. It's weird, I know, it doesn't make any sense. Amphetamines were first synthesized in 1887 in Germany. Over the years, I'm still finding her hair in my stuff. Of course, it's like this long, you know, and you'll start pulling the hair out and it just keeps coming and coming. It's like a worm, like a tapeworm. We couldn't use a vacuum cleaner because her hair would get in the vacuum cleaner, and it just took 1 or 2 hairs and the vacuum cleaner was clogged. I mean, you could, I'm stupid. Amphetamines were first synthesized in 1887 in Germany. Over the years, the substance was used as an inhaler under the name of Benzedrine and as an appetite suppressant. During World War II, amphetamines were used to combat fatigue by both sides. So if you had a flight from India to the Burma Road to someplace in Burma, you had to fly over the Himalayan mountains. It was like a 12-hour flight. Those guys would take amphetamines. I had a friend who flew B-52s during Vietnam. He flew out of Guam. His flight was a 17-hour flight from Vietnam to from Guam to Vietnam and back again was a 17-hour flight. And they took amphetamines. So, I mean, the military's used it for an extended length of time. And they used it in Vietnam. I don't know if they still use it. I'm assuming they don't. Let's pretend they don't. I'm sorry, she's naked and he's painting her breast. This is the kind of crap that was going on at that time. In the 1950s and 1960s, amphetamines were used in diet pills. By 1970, it was estimated that 6 to 8% of Americans were using amphetamines. They were using diet pills to stay skinny. Amphetamines were part of the fuel of the hippie movement and the Summer of Love in 1967. That's the year I graduated from high school. Congress passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970 in order to control the hippies, in order to control the protesters. A lot of strange things were going on. People were skinny back then. You can see all these kids back here. There's not a fat one in the, well, he's kind of portly. But people were skinnier then, not just because of the diet pills, but because we were eating, McDonald's had just started. It's only like 2 years old, so you'd buy 10 or 15 hamburgers at a time. That's what you did. I can remember working in the fields, and then we'd go to McDonald's, and you'd buy 5 hamburgers or 5 cheeseburgers. A hamburger was 10 cents, and a cheeseburger was 15 cents. So you could buy a whole lot of hamburger for $1, as it were. Okay, let's stop right here. We'll talk about performance enhancing drugs next time. As much fun as that is. I got tons of stories. I was around during the hippie times.